Thank you. Thank you, Luc, for the introduction. I'll switch to English if you don't mind. My French is not very good, to be honest. Welcome, good morning. Next to me, you see a perfect illustration of what's going on in the Netherlands at the present time. A side chapel of the Catholic Church, where nuns once took their places to attend Mass, has become a storage place for all sorts of objects. The objects come from a church that closed a few years ago. You can see candle holders, crucifixes, altar cards, passion cross, and so on and so forth. The church in which these things are being stored was then forced to close down itself in 2008. So now, in addition to all these things that are already stored here, there are all the pews, the organ, which has already been dismantled, the tabernacle, and many other religious objects to be dealt with. So the big question is, what should we do with these religious objects? Let me start by giving you a brief situation in the Netherlands. As in many other Western European countries, the traditional life of the church is sharply declining. For centuries, the Netherlands was a country in which religion played an important role in life. Until the mid-16th century, there was a single, undivided church, and after the Reformation, the Dutch Republic became Calvinist. For 80 years, the Protestant Dutch Republic was at war with Spain, Spain of course being Catholic. In the 17th century, the Dutch conquered a number of Catholic territories from Spain, which therefore came under Calvinist rule. You can still see the division today. The southern part of the Netherlands is mainly Catholic, while the north is mainly Protestant. And the two communities are roughly the same size. The high point of religious life was shortly after the Second World War in the 1950s and 1960s. With the exception of Ireland, for instance, the Netherlands had more people living in monastic communities per head of the population than any other country in Europe. Both in Protestant and in Catholic circles, the fabric of everyday life was steeped in religion. In fact, this ubiquitous presence of religion, which many experienced as oppressive and stifling, may well have been an important factor of the rapid decline of the traditional Christian faith in the Netherlands since the 1960s. And the pace of this decline is certainly very fast. Let me quote you a few figures. At the moment, the combined membership of the Catholic Church and the traditional Protestant Church is declining at a rate of about 170,000 every year. And we're a small country. If this trend were to continue at the same rate, the Protestant Church would cease to exist in the Netherlands by 2050. 25 years after that, the Catholic Church would suffer the same fate. Let's hope that this will turn out to be unduly pessimistic. Still, it's a fact that the dioceses are having to be restructured on a large scale and parishes are constantly merging. In some cases, up to 9 parishes have merged to become one. This obviously has major implications for the actual church buildings. Many churches have no option but to close. Take the largely Catholic city of Eindhoven, for example, with a population just over 200,000, where 10 of the city's 19 churches have had to close. The royal seat of The Hague, 7 of the city's 16 Protestant churches are closing or have already closed. The situation with orders and congregations is, if anything, more alarming still. I told you a moment ago that the Netherlands once had large numbers of people living in monastic communities, about 45,000 in the 1960s. Right now, there are fewer than 7,000, with an average age of 85. It's not far-fetched to predict that monastic life will more or less disappear in the Netherlands within 10 years. Between 1975 and 2008, the staggering number of 1,500 monasteries and convents were closed. There are only about 160 religious communities left now, and almost all of them are facing the threat of dissolution. Only 8 to 12 are expected to survive. Two important causes can be identified for these changes in the religious landscape. In the Netherlands, the most important factor is the growing trend towards secularization. Religion plays an ever smaller part in people's lives. The statistics suggest that this trend is set to continue in the future. What is more, people in the Netherlands have little social or cultural connection with churches. That is very different from a country like Spain. The Spanish population is also undergoing rapid secularization, but people still feel a strong social involvement with their local church. Next to me you see the diocesan town of Vic in Catalonia in Spain, celebrating the feast of Sant Miquel dels Sants. The saint's statue is about to be wheeled into the cathedral. The human towers on either side of the entrance form the pillars of an imaginary castle. The local community celebrates this church feast with great enthusiasm, as we can see in the photograph. Another factor has to do with demographic changes. More and more people are living in cities. This obviously has a major impact on church attendance in the countryside. There are fewer people there, so there are automatically fewer churchgoers. But the impact is felt in cities too. Church involvement is lowest in urban environments. So relatively speaking, fewer and fewer people are going to the church in the cities too. In a small country like the Netherlands, with a population just over 16 million and high levels of urbanization, demographic changes have a relatively minor impact. The situation is very different in countries like Germany, France or Spain, where entire villages are now uninhabited. In Germany, they are considering turning some countryside areas into national parks. That would mean that it would no longer be possible to live there. They're considering this simply because it's no longer feasible to maintain a fire service and a police service, a public transport system, or a regional authority for so few people. The decline of the traditional life of the church is not a cheerful story, and it has enormous implications for churchgoers, for churches, monasteries and convents, and also for religious objects. I'm going to say a few words about the first two before turning to religious objects, which I'm going to discuss in more detail. When parishes merge, it often means that one or more churches have to close. Parishioners find themselves suddenly having to attend a church with which they are not familiar. They don't always feel welcome straight away. What is more, they have to leave the church where their parents, they themselves, and often their children were baptized and married. It hardly needs saying that this is almost always a very emotional event. The second point has to do with churches, monasteries and convents. At the moment, about 7,600 churches are still in use in the Netherlands, but the number is falling rapidly. Between 2008 and 2011, 300 churches, monasteries and convents were closed. That amounts to 100 a year, or 2 every week. This obviously has major implications for the built heritage. It raises the important question of what to do with these buildings. It's not always possible to find a new use for a church. Some of the religious heritage is therefore threatened with demolition. Since I don't have time to deal with this at length here, I'll just outline the situation in the Netherlands very briefly, and to some extent my remarks will inevitably be generalizations. In the Netherlands, virtually all medieval churches are in Protestant hands. After the Reformation in the 16th century, all churches became the property of the Calvinists. In the second half of the 19th century, the Catholic Church enjoyed an upsurge, flourishing as never before. Catholics had been forced to worship in secret for almost 300 years in so-called clandestine churches. and the late 19th century Catholic revival saw neo-Gothic churches springing up all around the country. Two other periods that saw a lot of new churches being built were the 1930s, in between the two world wars, and the 1950s and 1960s, the period of post-war reconstruction. At the present time, we see parishes merging all the time, both Catholic and Protestant ones. In Protestant circles, Dutch Reformed congregations often merge with Calvinist ones. In general, the Dutch Reformed congregation will have a medieval church, while the Calvinists have a newer 20th century building. The new building is more practical and more spacious. The medieval one is small and costs more to maintain. On the other hand, the older building is a real church with history in contrast to today's modern building block architecture. What is more, medieval churches are protected buildings, and they are hard to sell or assign to a different use. These are all the things that are a lot easier with a modern building. So in most cases, the merged congregations ends up using the medieval church and the newer building is sold. Not infrequently, it's taken over and used for religious services again by a migrant community. After the merger, the medieval church is sometimes modified to correspond to its new liturgical use. And here's a fine example of it. The liturgical center has been moved, and most of the pews removed and replaced by chairs. This makes it possible to use the church for other activities. This is in a village, small village next to the city of Utrecht, where our museum is. There was a fierce opposition to these changes, and some churchgoers even started a protest group to try to stop the renovation. Even so, now that it has been done, everyone is very pleased with the result. When it comes to Catholic churches, allocating the church to a different use or allowing other activities there is a more sensitive issue. Many 19th century churches are classified as protected heritage, either by the state or the local municipality. Because of this, when parishes merge, they generally decide to sell churches dating from the 1930s, and especially those built in the 1960s. It may sound cynical, but because the land is more valuable without a church, many of these churches are threatened with demolition. So I'm particularly concerned about the loss of this relatively recent church heritage. That's all I'm going to say at this point about the buildings. There's a third consequence attached to the changing of religious landscape. Because of all the churches and convents that have had to close, many religious objects can no longer serve their original purpose. Although they may not always be all that conspicuous, these objects have an important story to tell. They've helped to shape the identity of the Netherlands. They're not just religious heritage, they're also cultural heritage. When mergers and closures are first being discussed, the question of what to do with these religious objects tends to be fairly low down the list of properties. But dealing with these objects poses a big challenge. In the medium term, the expectation is that at least 150,000 objects from churches and convents will become redundant. So the question arises, as I said in the beginning, what should we do with all these objects? Perhaps it would be better to put the question a bit differently. What should they do with all these objects? The Netherlands has a strict separation between church and state, which means that churches and convents have full ownership of their buildings and objects. The situation is different in countries such as Belgium or France, where the government owns part or all of these buildings and objects. So in the Netherlands, if we want to help church owners, we have to offer practical suggestions. We need to convince the owners of the added value of any remedy we put forward. But ownership is not the only relevant issue. We also have to take account of the specific nature of these objects. Religious heritage is sensitive heritage because of its sacred or devotional value. Putting objects in storage is scarcely a viable option. partly because it would cut them off from the original context, and partly because of the expense involved. What is more, the question arises of whether these objects would ever emerge from the storage facility. It's not fair to burden future generations with this problem. To avoid doing so, it's time to make choices and to put forward fundamental solutions. And specific guidelines are indispensable to this process. For all these reasons, in 2010, Musée Catharijneconvent decided to take the initiative to develop guidelines that would help owners decide what to do with their religious objects. In preparing these guidelines, we had two objectives. First, to make sure that valuable religious heritage is preserved, and second, to ensure that less valuable religious objects can be sold or de-accessioned in a transparent manner. These two goals led us to formulate guidelines that will be of practical value for both owners and heritage specialists. The guidelines on ways of dealing with religious objects, which I shall call, in short, the guidelines. But before going into a bit of detail about the guidelines and how we developed them, I would like to tell you something about Musée Catharijneconvent, the museum that took the initiative to prepare these guidelines. Musée Catharijneconvent is the National Museum of Christian Art and Culture of the Netherlands. It stands in what has been since medieval times the Archdiocese of Utrecht. The building itself is a 16th century convent of the Order of St. John, and it contains a rich collection of Christian heritage. There are 3 separate Catholic collections as well as a Protestant art collection, which together illustrate the turbulent history of Christianity in the Netherlands. Musée Catharijneconvent possesses a superb collection of medieval sculptures, paintings and manuscripts, 17th century religious paintings and church silverware, and one of the finest collections of liturgical vestments in Europe. Musée Catharijneconvent was recently given a special title. It was designated the Mother Museum in charge of coordinating research on matters relating to religious heritage. The museum is also acquiring a new task, one that is unique in the Dutch museum world. From 2013 onwards, Musée Catharijneconvent will be responsible for documenting and assessing the value of ecclesiastical art in Dutch churches. Clearly then, our museum had the best credentials for developing the guidelines. Now I want to look at the guidelines more closely now. Let me repeat our 2 objectives. First, to make sure that valuable religious heritage is preserved, and second, to ensure that less valuable religious objects can be sold or de-accessioned in a transparent manner. We translated these 2 objectives into 2 primary instruments or tools: the Religious Objects Assessment Guide and the Roadmap for Reusing and De-accessioning Religious Objects. And I'll refer to them in short as the Assessment Guide and the Roadmap. Together with a number of other instruments such as the guidelines for drawing up an inventory and an overview of relevant addresses, these tools, taken together, make up the guidelines. And this is the front of the Dutch guidelines. As I noted a moment ago, the Netherlands has a strict separation between church and state. This meant that it was essential for the guidelines to contain useful, practical suggestions if people in churches and convents were going to use them. So we adopted a very broad-based approach to developing these guidelines. It was absolutely crucial to get the churches themselves involved in the process. So representatives of the Catholic and Protestant churches were closely involved in preparing the guidelines. As a result, the end product is certainly a practical instrument and one that is closely aligned to ecclesiastical law or church's own guidelines. But the most important thing of all, in a country with as many religious divisions as the Netherlands, is that we ensure that every denomination feels that the language of the guidelines reflects its concerns. The involvement of churches was essential, but the active participation of national heritage agencies was also extremely valuable. These included the Cultural Heritage Agency of the Netherlands and the Dutch Monastic Life Heritage Center. Both worked very actively in helping to prepare the guidelines. This safeguarded the quality of the input from the point of view of scholarship. It also ensured that the latest views about matters like assessing the value of heritage were incorporated into the guidelines. Let me say a few things about how the guidelines work. The first chapter is the roadmap for reusing and deaccessioning religious objects. In 99% of the cases, the guidelines will be used to make decisions about selling or deaccessioning objects, so that is why we begin with this chapter. The roadmap consists of 6 simple steps that owners can follow when deciding how to reallocate objects for use elsewhere. The key word is transparency. As I have already said, church closures are always emotional events. It's absolutely vital to prevent disputes and rows developing about the fate of the religious objects in a church. We have designed a clear procedure for every stage of the process. It starts with a description of the preparations that have to be made. The next stages are drawing up the inventory, assessing the value of objects, making the final selection of objects, drawing up the plan for dealing with them, and finally implementing this plan. And you see the 6 steps in purple at your left. In the roadmap, we work out these stages in detail, with the exception of the section on assessing the value of objects. Assessing this value is the basis on which choices will ultimately be made. No decisions can be made on what to do with the objects until they have been properly assessed. So we prepared a separate detailed section on this assessment. We provide a lot of practical suggestions that church administrators who deal with the objects on a daily basis might not think of. For instance, some objects might be subject to special heritage protection legislation. Take the example of a painting by Peter Paul Rubens in the St. Paul's Church in Antwerp in Belgium. Now, I admit that a church council is not likely to consider selling the painting to some interested buyer overseas, but in any case, it's simply not possible. The painting has enormous art historical value, marking a turning point in Rubens' oeuvre, and is therefore protected by special heritage legislation. It's not allowed to leave Belgium. In addition, special procedures may apply to items such as sacred vessels or relics. For instance, relics are administered by the diocese by a body known as the Custos Reliquiarum. Here you see the reliquary of the Martyrs of Trier in Luxembourg Cathedral. An important part of the roadmap is the section describing the different uses to which objects may be reassigned and other ways in which they can be deaccessioned. We give a number of possibilities. The first is allocating it to be used in a different church in the same country. Unfortunately, of course, given the current rate of closures, this will seldom be a viable option. There are exceptions, however. These statues of the Virgin Mary with the Christ child and Joseph have been given a fine new home in a different Dutch church. The second possibility, which is generally thought preferable to temporary storage, the third option on our list, is reallocating objects to a church in another country. These church pews and votive candle from a Dutch church that had to close found their way to the Ukraine. Reallocating religious objects to new locations in other countries has become one of the main options to consider. The decline in church life is a Western trend. It may even be a trend that is mainly limited to Western Europe. The number of Christians is still actually growing in Europe, although at a slower pace than in other parts of the world. Worldwide, Christianity is growing faster than any other religion. It's really booming in South America, Africa, and nowadays in Asia too. The modest increase in the number of Christians in Europe is all in the former communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe. After decades of communism, in which there was no place for religion, the churches are full again. Full of people, I should say. Most of the religious objects were removed from the churches by the communist rulers. And precisely for this reason, religious objects and liturgical vestments are in great demand there. The next option is another one that will not often be possible: placing objects in museums. Most museum storage facilities are already filled to overflowing. If I look at my own museum, I seldom come across an object that would be a suitable addition to our collection. In fact, as chair of our acquisitions committee, I've taken it to renaming it the rejections committee. Objects can also be deaccessioned. This means that they do not go to another church or public institution. Religious objects may be given or sold to third parties. In these cases too, we emphasize the crucial importance of transparency. There's another important point to be borne in mind here. Giving or selling objects is a very sensitive issue within the Catholic Church. In many cases, these are sacred and consecrated objects. The idea that a chalice that has contained the blood of Christ might end up as a dish for candy is an abomination for Catholics. What is more, not all objects possess value. The final option, and I want to emphasize that is really the last resort, is therefore the destruction of religious objects. The roadmap includes a section about this possibility. This is unique and unprecedented. Never before has a publication about heritage issue broached the difficult problem of destruction. And I'm proud of it. It's an extremely difficult subject, but we should not avoid confronting it. Dealing with this issue reflects a realistic attitude to heritage. We can't preserve everything. Moreover, if we shy away from confronting this issue, others will have to do it. We also make a number of positive suggestions. For instance, if liturgical vessels are melted down, they could be used to make a new work of art that helps to forge closer ties within the community. Another possibility is donating the objects to a restoration studio. We recently carried out a small-scale interim evaluation to find out how well the guidelines are serving their purpose. The results showed that the roadmap in particular is greatly appreciated. People find it extremely useful because of the clear descriptions of procedures and because of the numerous practical suggestions. The most important step in the process of deaccessioning objects is assessing their value. As I have already emphasized, the assessment is the basis on which choices have to be made. To enable owners to establish the cultural value of the objects in their possession, we developed the Religious Objects Assessment Guide. In short, the Assessment Guide. For the Assessment Guide, we defined a number of specific criteria for assessing the value or significance of religious heritage. In a moment, I'll pick out a few of these criteria and discuss them. Underlying all these assessments, as I think I've made clear, is the fact that the movable religious heritage is currently under enormous pressure. Financial resources are diminishing all the time, and there's more work to be done by fewer people. All this means that when it comes to evaluating a collection of religious objects in a church or convent, we have to tackle this task in a pragmatic way. It's impossible to measure each individual object according to the criteria we formulated in the assessment guide. We have to start by making choices. In other words, one of our main recommendations is that it's important to start by making a pre-selection. Which objects are to be subjected to the more detailed assessment as described in the assessment guide? This obviously is a difficult issue. Making a selection, of course, is in itself a kind of assessment. However, I believe it's unavoidable. One of the services that Musée Catharijneconvent wants to start offering is a quick scan of the collection in situ. For a small fee, museum staff will help church owners decide which objects merit a more detailed assessment. The museum staff member could then determine the value of these objects together with the owner. Drawing up inventories and assessing the value of the rest of the collection could then be done, in many cases at least, by the church owners themselves. This may not be an ideal situation, but it would guarantee that, where resources are already overstretched, the valuable nucleus of the collection receives the attention it deserves. Another important recommendation that we make in the assessment guide is to ensure that the owner and the heritage specialist assess the objects together. Both possess a great deal of knowledge about the objects. This shared knowledge is also reflected in the assessment criteria. We distinguish three kinds of value: current value, historical value, and comparative criteria. This is inevitably rather dry material, but I'll try to bring it alive with a few examples. The criterion that we place at the top of our list is current value. This reflects what an object means to the community, its current emotional or religious value. High current value is often associated with objects that are venerated for their unique devotional properties, such as relics and certain statues of saints. But sometimes an object is of high current value because of its significance to a community's identity, or because it embodies a sense of shared destiny. It possesses a great significance for the owners. That's precisely why we put it at the top of the list. The overriding importance of establishing what a particular object means to the heritage community has only been fully recognized quite recently. In the guidelines, we go one step further. It's not the heritage specialist who assesses current value, but the owners, the people who actually use the objects. Current value may be of immense significance in a merger process. If churchgoers take objects with them from the church that has been closed to the one they are going to attend after the merger, it can help them to feel at home more quickly. I recently came across a good example of this in a small village near the city of Utrecht, where St. Lawrence's church had closed and the parishioners moved to St. Michael's. To help the newcomers feel at home, the statue of St. Lawrence, which you see here, was moved with them, and the St. Lawrence Chapel was created in St. Michael's. Art historical value of the statue can always be debated in cool terms, but the current value that this object possesses for the religious community is not a matter for debate. The historical values indicate an object's primary significance. Ideally speaking, determining an object's historical value is a joint effort on the part of the owner and a heritage specialist. The owner knows the objects well and often knows a great deal about their historical background. The heritage specialist is able to discuss the heritage value in a broader context. We have divided the historical values into three criteria: church historical value, general historical value, and art historical value. The first and third kinds of value are more common, relatively speaking. Objects often tell a story that is related to the church. And it's very common for religious objects to have been designed with great care. Next to me you can see one of my personal favorites, a beautiful blue enameled chalice from the 1950s. It has great art historical value, and it stands at the treasury of our museum. There's an interesting story attached to it, which I imagine actually enhances its value. The thing is, this chalice has never been used. Probably it was decided that the foot was too narrow, and the risk of it falling over was too great. And in the Catholic Church, of course, spilling Christ's blood is a mortal sin. It doesn't happen so often that objects are described as possessing general historical value. Still, there are always exceptions. Take this fine example next to me. It's a 16th century wooden chair which stands in the Cathedral of Saint-Pierre in Geneva. It is said to be the chair from which John Calvin lectured in his final years of his life. The chair, as a symbol of this key figure of the Reformation, therefore scores high in terms of general historical value. It is of national or indeed European importance. Once an object's historical value has been determined, it has to be compared with similar objects. Comparative criteria are used to decide how this particular object differs from others like it. This involves calculating its score in terms of rarity, physical condition, ensemble value, presentation value, and documentation value in relation to similar objects. You can also find it on the website. The comparative criteria may modify an item's historical value. The final score may end up higher, for instance, if the object is rare in some respect, or if it has definite educational value. And in other cases, the final score may end up lower, for instance, if the item is in a poor condition compared to other objects. I want to focus briefly on two special criteria. First, there's what we call ensemble value. The interrelationship between different objects or elements of an interior, or between the interior and the building and the surrounding area, determines the ensemble value. The value of the whole is sometimes greater than the sum of the parts. Because of the historical continuity that applies in the use of churches, ensembles are quite common. Research shows that the ensembles are present in 70% of the churches in the listed churches in the Netherlands. Many historical interiors have been preserved to a greater or lesser extent over the centuries. But now these interiors are under pressure. So it's important to get a good picture of whether an object belongs to an ensemble or not. Behind me, or next to me, you see a superb collection of an ensemble arising from a cohesive, integrated architectural plan known as a Gesamtkunstwerk. In 1869, the Guild of St. Bernulphus was founded, a society of priests and artists who wanted to promote Catholic art after the restoration of the Catholic Church in the Netherlands in 1853. The richly decorated Church of St. Willebroord exemplifies their work. Built in 1879, it has a superb neo-Gothic ensemble. A special criterion I want to single out here is presentation value. An object may have special appeal to the public. If it displays religious traditions and customs in an attractive way, it possesses educational or presentation value. This kind of value is important for objects destined for museums. In addition, with the rise of cultural tourism, growing importance is attached to presentation value in objects that are preserved in churches. This reliquary head is one of the most important treasures of the Diocese of Beja in southern Portugal. The diocese has 8 museums in which its religious heritage is displayed. The silver reliquary with skull comes from a small rural church. It is now displayed in the treasury of the Royal Basilica of Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception in Castelverde, which is open to the public. Heritage assessment is not an easy task. That is why we recommend enlisting the services of a heritage specialist. At the same time, as I have already noted a few times, church owners do lot themselves, not just because of the financial constraints, but also simply because it's their property. To make the process as easy as possible for owners, we developed an extra tool, the Heritage Assessment Form. It's kind of a Dutch text form. This is really helpful. To fill in this form, you merely check the appropriate boxes. The form is divided into sections for current value, historical value, and comparative criteria. On the right, there are questions that help the person filling in the form to determine each of the different values concerned. When filling in historical value and comparative criteria, you note down the interim score for the object you're assessing. At the end of the form, the interim scores are totaled, and you have arrived at the final determination of that object's value. Next to this final score, the current value, the value to the religious community, is listed separately. An important, relatively new finding that we have incorporated into the assessment form is the conclusion that regional or local heritage is not necessarily less important than national heritage. Because of this, the form allows for the possibility of scoring on an object on both levels. To give you an example, this crucifix dates from around 1315 and hangs in Sweden's second oldest wooden church. Rather roughly carved, it was probably made in a local workshop. It illustrates the fact that objects may possess value on a national as well as a local or regional level. For this local crucifix also tells a national story. After the Reformation, Catholic objects were removed from churches en masse, but seldom destroyed. In the early 20th century, many of them were brought back and placed in Sweden's Lutheran churches. The interim evaluation revealed that 30% of the respondents had used the assessment guide. That's a lower percentage than for the roadmap. The most important reason for this is that in many cases people had not yet reached the stage of assessing the objects. Clearly, the same applies to the assessment form. A large percentage of those questioned stated that they had not yet used the form, but that they planned to do so later. Despite the fact that it was used less often than the other instrument, the assessment guide was described as useful. And I think it's very important that we continue to develop the assessment system for religious heritage. How can we help to simplify the assessment process without undermining the quality of that process? In 2011, we organized a symposium about movable religious heritage and launched the guidelines. The central question of the symposium was, how can we meet the challenges facing us in relation to the movable religious heritage? During the symposium, we presented the guidelines to representatives of 6 different churches, the umbrella organization for orders and congregations, and the Ministry of Education, Culture and Science. The symposium took place in a medieval church in Utrecht, and it just happened to be the church that had first fallen prey to the iconoclastic fury in 1566. So this was a historical place in which to discuss the challenges of dealing with the Netherlands' movable religious heritage. The fact that so many representatives of different churches were gathered together on one stage in itself spoke volumes. The intense ecumenical cooperation was key to the project's success. The input of knowledge from diverse backgrounds and disciplines was indispensable. Moreover, it created wide-ranging support for the decisions within the administrative layers of the various churches. We also developed a website for people working in churches. It contains answers to all sorts of questions, and the guidelines can be downloaded from the site. Below you see the address of the English language website, guidelinesreligious.com, religiousobjects.com, and it should be online as of from yesterday. I haven't checked it yet myself. More importantly, perhaps, we have now issued an English edition of the guidelines. And I brought one copy with me. It's hot off the press. I just received a few copies before I flew to Canada at the last moment. Philippe, I will hand you over my last copy, but I will send Luc about 40 another one. So, besides detailed descriptions of the roadmap and the assessment guide, the book also gives an account of how we produced these instruments. And if you're involved with policy making in the area of religious heritage, you may find this publication helpful, and I would be happy to send you one. The PDF file can also be downloaded from the website. The guidelines are a unique document. No one has ever developed an assessment framework or deaccessioning guidelines for religious objects before. They incorporate the conclusions of the latest studies on heritage, such as the direct influence of the heritage community and the conviction that national heritage is not necessarily more important than local or regional heritage. Furthermore, this publication is the first set of guidelines to explicitly discuss the painful and difficult subject of destruction. The guidelines are not intended exclusively for the Christian denominations that are traditionally found in the Netherlands. They may also be useful for other denominations such as Orthodox, Evangelical or Pentecostal churches, or faith communities such as Islam, Judaism, Hinduism or Buddhism. The guidelines will help churches, orders and congregations, and heritage specialists to make well-founded choices when dealing with their religious heritage. There's a great need, certainly in the Netherlands, but undoubtedly in the rest of the Western world too, for a simple, practical instrument to help make the right choices. And I believe that these guidelines fill that gap. Thank you very much. Any questions, perhaps? Or was it all clear?
I have one.